Hello, my name is Bennett Goldberg. I'm the director of the Searle Center for Advancing Learning and Teaching and a professor of physics and astronomy at Northwestern University. Today, I want to talk to you about blending asynchronous and synchronous content in your online learning and teaching. Today's work was co-created with a colleague of mine, Susie Calkins. She's the director of faculty initiatives at the Searle Center for Advancing Learning and Teaching. And I'd also like to give a shout out for my amazing colleagues in CERTL, the Center for the Integration of Research, Teaching, and Learning, and in particular, Robin Greenler and Sarah Hokinson. I'm also indebted to some amazing colleagues from the Inclusive STEM Teaching Project across a wide range of institutions. This slide's due to a friend of mine, Derek Bruff from Vanderbilt University. Traditional learning and teaching in higher ed means students coming to class, and that's where they have their first exposure to the content and material. Often it's a lecture or a transmission approach to learning and teaching. But generally, that's their first place in which they explore or listen to or dig into the kinds of content that we provide them. The expectation is they'll assimilate that and put it within their own scaffolding and connect it to their learning modes after class. This is where they practice things and they assimilate, and we give them problem sets and writing to do and other reading to do and reflect. A blended or a flipped approach takes a shift in that. First of all, it takes a social constructivist learning, which is learner-centered. So not transmission, but rather student-centered learning. In addition, it adds this piece of first exposure to content that happens before class. So that when students come to class, they've thought through some ideas, they've read a piece, they've listened to a lecture, they've tried a problem, they've explored finding out information or observing something. And so when they come to class, it's not the first time of exposure. So class can be more around practice and feedback, open discussion, digging deeper into the content, embellishing it with your expert advice and with small lecture pieces of your own, but also a place where students can come together and see what they experienced and be guided by you, the expert instructor. After class, you can test knowledge, you can do more practice, you can also allow them further exploration. The key principles in blending asynchronous and synchronous content are the following. First, motivating students' asynchronous work products. Students who aren't used to an asynchronous setting might not be motivated to do the work. So we'll talk through in many examples of how to motivate them by both giving credit for it, as well as agency, as well as choice, and other kinds of things that you might use to motivate their work. A key issue is also making connections between what students do before class and then what you have them do in class. This values the work they do outside, and then you highlight it and demonstrate it and build on it in your in-class synchronous sessions. Feedback is a critical piece of this whole process in both asynchronous and synchronous modalities. And it's both you giving students feedback within those modalities, but also you accepting feedback from them, from how is it working and what's going well and what can be changed or improved. Finally, it's critical, as always, to be completely transparent and explicit, not only in what you're doing and what your expectations are, but why you're doing it. Pull back the curtain a little bit. Students learn better when you show them the metacognition of learning so that they can reflect on how they themselves are learning. That's been demonstrated to create more knowledge, more learning, and better outcomes from your students. I want to take a quick segue into active learning because, of course, a lot of what we talk about in both asynchronous and synchronous settings, whether in person or online, has to do with creating active learning, again, from a social constructivist place of learning and teaching. Active learning are modalities and pedagogies that you use that help students think for themselves, help them make connections, help them raise questions, help them dig into things to reflect deeply on the content or the ideas or the conflicts that you present them with. Active learning also is a place where peers collaborate in pairs or in larger groups. It enhances communication between students. It allows them to solve problems and make decisions for their own. Your job as an instructor is to engage and allow those activities to happen. So how does one allow those activities to happen? How does one create those moments of learning and active learning? As an instructor, you want to frame authentic questions, questions that have meaning, are open-ended and deep and reflective of the student's own cultures and experiences. You need to provide them time and space to think and to do and to share. Whether that happens asynchronously or synchronously, a student needs time to think and reflect. You have to create assignments and activities that provoke meaningful learning. Think about your learning goals, the higher level ones about synthesis and evaluation and creativity, and use those learning goals to really guide your activities. And then, of course, for a social aspect of learning, it's your job as an instructor to construct pairs, groups, and teams. All of these things can be done in synchronous and in asynchronous modalities. These active learning strategies are across a continuum. Very simple tasks that you turn to your neighbor, think, pair, share, minute papers, polling, all kinds of things like that. Complex tasks, group projects, creative things that last a long time, working on internships or all kinds of things. They tend to be more carefully structured, have more intermediate stages where you act as an instructor and giving feedback and students can learn from themselves. Strategies aren't better or worse, they just are on a continuum of the amount of engagement and then therefore the amount of intentional construction that you do. Here are some examples that will help you think about how to use active learning strategies in your synchronous setting. Think about minute papers and respond, polls that you can do in Zoom, breakouts that you can create, case studies that you might have groups dig into. Think about how you might structure debates or role play or other kinds of things, putting students in breakout groups and then bringing them back to their presentation to a larger group. How could students create content, look things up, create outlines in breakouts, in Google Docs, all working together? These are strategies that are active learning in synchronous settings. Please see a few of my other videos, the one on translating your teaching into an online setting for more around how to do this in a Zoom environment. What can you do asynchronously? Pre-knowledge checks. Students have had a lot of experience, likely in the kinds of content that you are providing in your class. See where they are. Use that as a pre-session knowledge check. Give them an ability to reflect on how well they know it and their own self-efficacy. Questions and problems can be done in an asynchronous place. Discussion boards and written or video blogs are ways that students can share with each other and with you, the instructor. Peer feedback can happen asynchronously. Ungraded quizzes, reflection activities, group reading and annotation, for example, in Perusall, which is a tool that I've used regularly, and I'll show you in a few minutes. Actually, I'll show you now. This is a Perusall of a Danowitz and Tuitt article about inclusive pedagogy that Susie Calkins and I used. We took 40 students and put them into 8 groups of 5. And each group of 5 had their own document, their own article. Perusall then puts those 5 students within that group, and you can see that they're commenting back and forth about certain passages that they saw. You can require a certain number of contents, you can look through them yourselves, and then you can work on it. This is just one of many examples of how to do asynchronous close reading with student commentary where they share with each other and can share with you. Look at what they write. Pull a couple of their comments into your synchronous setting. When I do this workshop with faculty and graduate students, we usually break out into a workshop activity right now. They go through some questions about how they might want to structure their session, and then I ask them to report out. What I've done here is simply put up the thoughts for you to consider. So the first place to begin is, what do you want your students to know or experience or reflect on or examine before your synchronous settings? Essentially, what are your learning goals for pre-session? Once you can think through a couple of those learning goals for pre-session, then The next step is to say, well, what kind of activities would support this? Some reading, some video, some exploration on the web, open-ended questions, discussion boards, blogs. What kind of activities support that kind of learning? And how will you know they achieve it? Do you want to give them a quick quiz? Do you want to poll them at the beginning of your synchronous session? What are the ways in which you'll see whether they're doing it and whether they're achieving the learning that you design? Now, in your synchronous settings, what are your learning goals for that? Write down 3 or 4 of your learning goals for a particular synchronous session, and then how will you connect the asynchronous work that students have done to the synchronous session that you design? Now, later you can think about what to do post-session. What can you reflect on? What can you dig deeper on? We're going to skip that for the remainder of this workshop and just focus on this kind of work. Finally, what challenges do you foresee? It's always good to predict those challenges, so when inevitably many of them come up, there's not a great deal of surprise. Here's an example of a class that I designed together with Andrew Duffy and Manu Jarawala and many other faculty in the Boston University Physics Department over more than a decade. This was a studio or a scale-up type introductory physics class. It was algebra-based, and there were 400 students in it. They were typically broken up into 4 or 5 sections. And for the sections that we taught in a flipped classroom, there was quite a bit of work that students would do before class. There was a lot of the pre-lecture kinds of materials. They would watch a video that Andrew Duffy created, or they would read parts of the book, and they would answer a few questions, maybe go through a simulation or something like that. They would be asked also in pre-session 2 or 3 critical things: to write down 1 sentence or 2 sentences about reflecting on what they just learned or how they did the problem. Ask if they had any questions or comments about it. And then a sliding Likert scale that's saying, I knew this really well, or I'm really struggling with this concept, a self-efficacy question. So when these were due 1 hour before session, I could quickly glance through and see, how well they felt they knew the material, pretty well, modestly, or not so well, and it would change what I did in class. I would quickly glance through some of the written comments or questions and put those in my first slides that I might do, connecting their pre-lecture, pre-session activities to what we did in class. Pre-COVID, this class was taught in a studio classroom with flat learning and students working together in groups. Right now, it's being taught by Andrew Duffy and Manu Jarawala and other colleagues at Boston University completely online. It still has the pre-lecture and the homework and the online forums and online office hours, but all of the lecture discussion and lab now is in an online Zoom environment. Let's go back to those key concepts and spend a few minutes digging into each one. This first one was around motivating. Give credit for the work in pre-session. Honestly, if you give 5% total number of points for, say, 10 or 15 or 20 pre-sessions that they do, the vast majority of students will do them. Require them to respond with a short quiz or an annotation or a post, and count it. Give it points. Second motivating characteristic is to create a habit. Do it every time. Make sure you have the same structure in place. Remember, students are learning the online component for the first time for many of them. Give a choice of assignments. Give 2 or 3 options. Agency motivates students. Make sure that your prompts really think about requiring student-directed learning, giving an open-ended prompt that requires them to go out and figure something out, to go out and discover something, to observe, to reflect on that. And that will also encourage individual responses. And these are activities that students find meaningful. Sometimes you can mix it up. Do a blog one week where students are simply posting things, and then the next week have an embedded discussion thread. And then in the asynchronous discussion-based things, make sure you allow it to brew. giving students the time to respond to each other. If you respond very frequently, you will shut down the conversation that they have. So really think about minimal and targeted instructor or teaching assistant commentary. The next piece is about making connections between students' asynchronous work product to their synchronous activities that you design for them. It's critical to bring the work they do forward into the synchronous setting and to do it each time. Think about pulling out student comments, student questions, responding to them in class. These things can be done anonymously. And so students who might be embarrassed about asking certain questions in class or in session might be able to put them in a pre-session commentary, and then you can bring it forward. You should keep track and highlight students' comments and statements and work. Make sure you're sharing different students throughout the quarter or throughout the semester. Be intentional about telling them that you will do so. Look at the learning goals that you had in your asynchronous session and make sure that the kinds of the first prompts that you do within your synchronous session are connected to those and build on that knowledge and that learning that you expected them to do and that they did before your session. Think about having groups come together asynchronously and then present within the synchronous setting. All of things honor the work that students do asynchronously when you bring it into the synchronous session. How does feedback roll into this whole process? Think about giving small notes in many places, Perusall, Piazza, or other kinds of discussion boards. Use caution in discussion boards, of course. Make sure that your feedback when you give it is very open-ended. Hey, I have this idea, or I think about this, or I heard a student comment about this once. Sort of taking your own expert advice and putting it aside, giving students more options of taking things in a discussion board in different directions. And then the reverse, ask for feedback from them. Ask for ways that they think the discussion boards can be more engaged and that they think you can allow more opportunities for them to work and bring their asynchronous content into your synchronous session. Finally, being transparent and explicit in what you are doing and why. Put it in your syllabus, weekly directions, instructions in every assignment. When you're doing your assignments in synchronous online sessions, make sure you give instructions, make sure it's in the breakout session, so that everybody has an idea and a clarity in what you're doing and why. And make sure you explain the pedagogical point of it, pulling back the curtain and allowing that metacognition piece to come in so that students get a sense of why they are learning the way you have designed it. Here's a matching tool I often do in my workshops. On the left-hand side are things like outcomes desired, really pedagogies. Let's say I want anonymity in my students, or I want to elevate student voice, or I want everyone to participate, or I want quick feedback, or I want longer and thoughtful responses. I ask faculty and instructors that I'm training with and teaching assistants to take a tool and to draw from one side to the other and thereby make connections in what it is that they're doing. So I'll have them say, well, back and forth discussions might be nicely done, for example, on a whiteboard. Long, thoughtful responses linked to Google Docs. Full participation could be done, when everybody is on their cameras and microphones. It's very easy to use emoticons. Accountability can happen in multiple places, but certainly in polls. Thank you for being with me today and for looking at this. I'll leave up these tiny URLs for a second so that you can jot them down. If you link to these tiny URLs, you'll have a copy of this slide deck and a copy of the worksheet that I referred to in the beginning part of this talk. Again, thank you and have a great day, and good luck in your asynchronous and synchronous learning online.